Hola a todos, soy Javier Poveda y esto es De Bien TV, el canal donde te lo vas a pasar de bien, se me acaban las ideas, mientras aprendes geografía, historia del arte, economía y empresariales, aunque solo un poquito. Este vídeo lo he dirigido a mis alumnos de 4º Sección, CEIPSO, el Encinar, Torrelodones, zona confinada. Así pues, today we are going to study the second part of the Unit 5, the Second Industrial Revolution and Imperialism, this time the last part, which is Imperialism, la parte que mola. So, let's start to define imperialism. Imperialism took place during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is considered to happen between the years 1870 to the 1914, before the beginning of the First World War. During this period, a number of developed countries took control of other regions and lands all over the world, and these lands became colonies and formed part of the various colonial empires. The objective of imperialism was both political control and economic exploitation of all these new acquired lands of all these colonies. So what were the causes of this imperialism, of this formation of colonial empires? Well, this imperial expansion was mainly a result of the rise of finance capitalism, which we have studied in the previous video. The increase in production forced industrialized countries to look for new markets outside Europe where they could find new sources of raw materials and cheap sources of energy, and also for selling manufactured goods and invest capital. There was a surplus of manufactured goods and of capitals. We studied that when we talk about the economic cycles, so they need new markets in order to allocate all of these resources, both the goods of their industry and the surplus of capital, and also for looking for, or for the provide to provide a new a continuous source of raw materials for their industry as well as sources of energy. But there were also other reasons. For example, the international prestige. Yo la tengo más grande que tú. And it was also for the military reason, to control strategic locations for their own security, also to allocate most of this population that were unemployed in the metropolis. So many people actually had to emigrate to these new colonies in order to look for a better way of life. Also for the scientific progress, which required geographic expeditions to unknown areas, mainly the interior of the African continent. And finally, because of a cultural reason, which is the supremacy or the belief of perdón que me muero, a supremacy of the white people, and a moral reason because the white people had the duty to bring European culture, the Western culture, and the Christian values to all these indigenous societies, which were in the mental schemes of the people of this time. They were less civilized than the superior culture which was ours. So, well, here you have a graphic. As you can see, the Europeans dominated the economy of the world in the early 20th century. Here you have three texts from Cecil Rhodes, Jules Ferry, Joseph Chamberlain, which supported the formation of these colonial empires and the supremacy of the white race. Here you have the increase in population. Here you can see that in the total dominant countries between throughout all the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the population grew 3 times in the dominant countries, in the industrialized countries, so they needed to emigrate. Here's Cecil Rhodes and another illustration which supported the formation of these colonial empires. This is Africa in the beginning of the 19th century. As you can see, all or most of the interior of the continent was unknown, was unexplored. Here you can see also, here you have unexplored region. They didn't know what was there, if there were any richness, any materials they could use. Spoiler, there were. So they went there with there are very famous these expeditions by Dr. Livingstone and Henry Stanley, which a ver. Vamos a ver. This is not working. Here, the expedition of Livingstone and Stanley in the sub-Saharan Africa, which actually Livingstone was lost and Stanley was ordered by his newspaper in America to find him, and he finally did. Here, this famous episode, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, que le dijo, Dr. Livingstone, supongo, le dijo el otro hombre, pues sí. And well, this is more examples of the white supremacy, of the moral duty of the white people, in this case the British and the Americans, to civilize, to bring these people, okay, in this case is the people of the America, and in the case of the British Empire, African and Asian people, in order to reach their final goal, which is civilization. And what were these? What was the territories? What were the territories of these colonial empires? Well, we have to know. Well, this is a map of the world in 1914, prior to the beginning of the World War I, the First World War, and we have to know just the most important colonies of each empire. In the case of the British Empire, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, East Africa and South Africa. The French Empire, West Africa, the Equatorial Africa, Madagascar and the French Indochina, la Indochina francesa. In the Portuguese Empire, they continued with the colonies they had since the modern age, Angola and Mozambique. Italy, they went to Libya, Eritrea and Somalia, the eastern part of Somalia. Belgium had the Congo in Central Africa, and the Germans had Togo, Cameroon, the German East Africa, which is nowadays Tanzania, and German Southwest Africa, today is Namibia. They also had the New Guinea and some islands in the Pacific, but these are the most important. Spain, we had Rio de Oro, Sahara Occidental, and Guinea Equatorial, Rio Muni, Fernando Po, and also the protectorate in northern Morocco. We will study that in the third part of the next unit. The United States control Hawaii and the Philippine Islands, and the Japanese, they control Korea, and later they went into China, the northern part of Manchuria, and so on. The Dutch had Indonesia, which was called the East Indies in that time. So, how did they perform this occupation and administration of the colonies? Well, there were several types of colonies, and we are going to study the three main types. They were differentiated according to their political value or economic value, or the purpose of the colony. First, we have the most common is the exploitation colonies, which were the ones that had economic value. In these colonies, the indigenous people were governed by a white minority originating from the colonizing country. So there was a white minority that ruled over the majority of the indigenous people, and they exploited the area economically. For example, India by the British Empire. Then we have settler colonies, which had socio-economic value. They have economic value but also social value. The majority of the population in these colonies are emigrants from the colonizing country. So since the most part of the society of the people were the same as in the metropole, they enjoyed certain governmental autonomy. For example, the dominions in the British Empire, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And finally, the protectorates, which were areas of strategic interest in which the indigenous population maintained its own government. There was an indigenous government, but it was controlled mostly economically and military by a colonizing power which was in charge of their defense and their foreign policy. For example, Morocco with the protectorates of Spain and France. And because of this imperialism, there were several conflicts and tension between the colonizing powers. The most important, well, were those three: the Fasora incident, the Boer War, and the Boxer Rebellion. But first, we have to talk about the Berlin Conference, which was held in the German capital between 1884 and 1885, in which they set a series of rules in order to colonize a country, in order to acquire a new colony, besides giving the Congo to the King of Belgium, Leopold I. So, in order to claim a territory, you have to militarily occupy the area. So you can make a good claim. What was the consequence of this? There was a race for the colonies in Africa. Okay, so many of these European countries, they rushed for the Africa's wealth. So because they needed to be the first to arrive to the territory they wanted. And this caused the Fasora incident. Fasora is in Sudan, and this happened in 1898 because, well, between the French and the British, because the French wanted to create an empire from the east to the west of Africa, and the British from the north to the south. The British won. We also have the Boer War between 1899 and 1902. The Boer republics were a couple of states in the interior part of South Africa, and they were rich in gold and diamonds, and the English, which are pirates, they invaded them and they occupied them and annexed to their colony of South Africa. Finally, the Boxer Rebellion in the year 1900, which were the Boxers were Chinese nationalists, which were opposing the European occupation of several parts of China and the European control on the Emperor of China, and they started an uprising and they sieged the Forbidden City in Peking. But after a year, a combined army of all these colonial powers defeated them. Here you have a cartoon with a Chinese which is surprised, what are you doing with my country? And here are the Queen of England, the Kaiser, the Tsar, the Japanese Emperor, and the French Republic. They are dividing China for them. This is Africa prior to this Berlin Conference, and this is Africa after the Berlin Conference. The only independent countries were Liberia here and Ethiopia here. The rest was part of the European countries. Here is the Fasora incident. This is Fasora. The French wanted to create an empire from here to here, and the British from here to from Egypt to South Africa. The British won. These are the Boer republics, the Orange Free State, and the what they call the South Africa Republic. And these are the Boxers, the Chinese nationalists, which sieged the Forbidden City, which where the embassies of the Western countries were located, and they finally were defeated and their members beheaded. Ping, 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 ha. So, what were the consequences of imperialism? Well, the political consequences were that there was the imperialism caused a rivalry between these colonizing powers, these European countries, which later will be part, or will be one of the causes of the start of the First World War. Also, the economic consequences was that in the colonies they established a single crop and extraction economy. So the only economic activity, or almost the only economic activity, was the extraction of raw materials, which in these industries of extraction they used the indigenous workforce, so they were kept away from their traditional means of survival, and this encouraged the inequality all over the world, and this led to the economic dependence of the colony, which it is maintained even today. Okay, today this is called neocolonialism, and it means that most of the former colonial powers still have a lot of influence in these former colonies. Also, the demographic reason that the pressure of the population growth in the colonizing countries was lessened by the migration of inhabitants to the colonies. We have already seen that in a graph. And the population in the colonies, they increased a lot. Why? Because these immigrants, with them, they brought these improvements in health, in medicine, in hygiene, and they introduced them in the colonies. And finally, the social and cultural. These colonizing countries, they imposed the Western culture on the indigenous people, and their own culture, the culture of the indigenous people, the Aborigines, they were relegated to a second class status. And also the social and racial segregation developed, because since the colonists, the Western people, they considered themselves to be superior to them, so their racial segregation happened, and it continued. This racial segregation continued until recent years. For example, well, I think I will show you some photos now. Well, these are the tensions between the European powers in this balance. These are Rwanda workers in the Belgian Congo. In the Belgian Congo, the rulers, the Belgians, they committed a lot of atrocities, and they used the black people workforce to work in these industries. In this case, the gold and diamond mining. And well, this is a chart in which you can see all this organization, and this is the increase in population in Africa. As you can see, first, well, at the beginning of this period of imperialism, and 80 years later, the population had doubled. These are the countries with the most emigration. Here you can see in the United Kingdom and Ireland, almost, well, or more than 7 million people emigrated. That is a lot of people. And these are the consequences of this social and racial segregation. Here, they mutilated the hands of the black people. This is a Belgian missionary, which this is what they did with the people who didn't obey them. But also they tried to teach them about the Western values. Here, the alphabet, okay. And this racial segregation was maintained until very recently. For example, the most iconic example is the apartheid in South Africa. Here you can see a non-white shop, a beach only for white people, and another beach only for white people. Okay, and this is in 1979, 1985, and 1989. Okay, I was a little boy right back there, so until very recently, because I am not that old. And finally, just examples of the art. In this period, we have the cast iron architecture, the Eiffel Tower, Santa Genoveva or Saint Genevieve, the modernist architecture, mostly in the United States, with the skyscraper, in Chicago, in Barcelona with the modernismo de Antonio Gaudí. And in painting, we have the realism with Courbet, Millet, which depicted real people Okay, not just religious or mythology or kings or the nobility, but real people in their paintings, and the vanguards with Impressionism, with Monet, Renoir, Manet, those are prostitutes, this is a bar, and this is ballet, and the landscapes. Bueno, Sorolla con el luminismo, y fijaos cómo trata la luz en la arena mojada, es una pasada, Sorolla. And also post-impressionismo, this is puntillism, and this is, bueno, Cézanne, more Cézanne, Van Gogh, todo el mundo conoce a Van Gogh, La noche estrellada, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec, and in sculpture, the god is Auguste Rodin, los burgueses de Calais, el pensador El Beso, and l'origine du monde, el origen del mundo, el potorrillo. Que este cuadro fue muy famoso, sobre todo por el revuelo que causó, aunque no fue expuesto mucho. Y con esto hemos terminado. Me fastidia un montón no ver el arte como Dios manda, pero es que no me tiene que salir. Si el vídeo es muy largo, luego no lo veis. Y si no lo veis, pues tampoco lo veis. Pero bueno, a mí me gusta hacerlos. Así que espero que este vídeo os haya ayudado a entender un poquito mejor el tema. Ya sabéis que cualquier cosa me podéis escribir o me podéis preguntar. Y así que me despido ya hasta la próxima con la Primera Guerra Mundial, que es lo que mola. Ya sabéis, seguidme en redes sociales, Instagram CDFDaisy, en Twitch lo tenéis ahí, twitch.tv de Bienstream, aunque sé que en cuarto no lo ve ni Dios. Gracias por verlo y nos vemos en el próximo.